So last time we started talking about how to get rid of your fear of public speaking. Today we're going to move on and start talking about speeches themselves. But what we also need to discuss is an important question of what is speech communication. Now, that might seem kind of like an obvious question, right? It's you go up and you do your speeches. But it's a little bit more complicated than that. So before we can start doing these, we need to talk about this, which is rhetoric. Now, this is going to be the overarching theory for the entire semester. For this course, it's going to be extremely important. Some of you might be thinking, oh, rhetoric, I kind of know that from Rhetorical Question, or maybe you've heard it on the news somewhere. Some of you might also be thinking, I have no clue what rhetoric means. And that's perfectly fine. What I'm going to cover in this lecture first is the most obvious question. What is rhetoric? I'll then cover two different theories that are going to be important to the class and talk about how we're going to be using rhetoric throughout the entire semester. Now, in order to talk about rhetoric, I need to go way back. I'm talking ancient Greece. So, for those of you who are familiar with the ancient Greeks, you may know that they are credited with creating the first democracy. Now, their form of democracy was a full democracy, which is different than the kind of democracy that we have. So let me explain how it worked. What would happen is someone would go up, and let me specify that someone had to be a white male who owned property, who was over the age of 25. So only a certain segment of the population was participating, but I digress. So what he would do is basically say, hey, this is my property. So before they had a full democracy, they had dictatorial rule, a lot of property got taken, or more commonly, hey, I want to make this change, I want to pass this law. And someone else might stand up and say, nope, you can't do that. And so he would make his argument, and he would make his argument, and basically laws would get passed. Votes were made, and that's how decisions were made. Now, you're probably wondering at this point, why are we talking about the ancient Greeks and democracy? I'm not in a government class or a history class. Well, this guy, who you may or may not recognize, Plato, he decided, look, if people are making speeches and they are basically making these monumental changes in their government and for their people, this is something we need to look at. This is something that needs to be investigated. So when we first talk about, well, what's rhetoric? We credit both Plato and Aristotle, as you can see there, as being the people who founded the ideas of rhetoric and what rhetoric actually is. So let's look at their definitions. First off, we'll talk about Plato. Now, Plato is credited with coining the term of rhetoric, but Aristotle is actually the father of rhetoric, and that was because he was a bit skeptical of rhetoric. So let me talk about his definition. So Plato defined rhetoric as the art of winning the soul by discourse, and I love this definition for two reasons. One, he says it's an art, and to be honest, to really persuade, to effectively inform, it truly is, and it's going to be something that we're going to craft over the semester and really develop. The other thing is winning the soul. So Plato saw rhetoric as not just sort of a persuasive force. He really saw it as something that could be very powerful, and if used unethically, could be dangerous. So we can look at someone like Hitler, who was able to use persuasive techniques to motivate people to do horrible atrocities. And in no way, shape, or form am I celebrating Hitler as a speaker, but in many ways Plato understood rhetoric. And there have been many other instances beyond Hitler in which rhetoric has been used for horribly unethical means. Now, the father of rhetoric is Aristotle. He defined rhetoric much more practically, and he was really some of the major theories that we look about within rhetoric come from Aristotle. So he defined it as the faculty of discovering in any particular case all of the available means of persuasion. Now, two things to pinpoint here. One is in any particular case. I'm going to talk about something in regards to that in a second, but basically it's really important to understand that when you go up and have a situation for a speech, when you need to persuade or inform, there are certain things you have to take into account, right, in that particular case. The other thing is available means of persuasion. So I like to think of rhetoric as kind of like a persuasive toolbox, right? You can pull out different things from it, and of course you would use them specific to the particular situation. A more modern definition of rhetoric comes from Gerard Hauser, and he defines rhetoric as communication that attempts to coordinate social action. The goal is to influence human choices on specific matters that require immediate attention. Now, it's not important to remember him, but this definition is really good because if you think about it, a lot of things that we do are rhetoric. So a eulogy, for instance, requires that people come together and grieve. Or a billboard or a commercial persuades us to go to a movie or buy a product. A debate requires that you consider a particular candidate or position. So when you start to think about this, rhetoric is something that is all around us. We just really haven't been trained to think of these types of things as rhetoric. So now that we understand what rhetoric is, we're going to talk about two important theories for rhetoric. And the first one is the rhetorical situation. Now this goes back to what Aristotle talked about of his definition of rhetoric in any particular case. So when we think about rhetoric, we have to understand that there's both a context and purpose to when you are trying to communicate, make a speech, when you're trying to persuade. So rhetoric doesn't occur in a vacuum, and I'm not talking about that kind of vacuum, but that there is situations that are going on, right? There are particular rules and things you should and should not do. So for instance, you wouldn't randomly stand up in a classroom when your professor is lecturing and start making a persuasive speech. People would look at you funny. Your professor probably wouldn't be very happy with you. So that's what we're talking about here. So if we define rhetoric really broadly, I know I've thrown a couple of definitions at you, but rhetoric can be effectively using language. Then very broadly, the rhetorical situation are the circumstances in which you communicate. So I'm pulling this from Purdue University, and when you go up to speak, there are two major things you need to consider. And this is what we're going to be talking about throughout the course, right? What am I trying to accomplish? And as a speaker, that might seem really obvious, right? Well, it's an informative speech. I'm trying to inform my audience. It's persuasive. I'm trying to persuade them. But it's much, much more complicated than that. You really need to pinpoint specifically what you want to do, and we're going to talk about that more later on. But the other thing that's important to recognize in rhetoric is, what can I accomplish? There are going to be opportunities, but there's also going to be constraints and limits. So for instance, if you wanted to go to an NRA meeting, you're not really going to convince a lot of people to agree to stringent gun control. So there are limits. There's only so much you can do. Another way to think of the rhetorical situation is a triangle that has 4 parts. So at its core, you have your purpose, right? Going back to that question of what am I trying to accomplish? At the top, you have you as a speaker. Now, by speaker, I don't just mean, okay, you speak, ta-da, you're the speaker. But really, what are you trying to do as the speaker? How are you trying to portray yourself? Are you trying to be a very serious, informed speaker? Are you trying to persuade them, so you need the audience to trust you? Are you trying to be more of a humorous speaker for maybe a less serious topic? Of course, to the audience is going to be very important here. So who is your audience? What do they know? What do they don't know? What are their beliefs? All of those things are going to change how you're going to present your information. And then, of course, last, the message itself. Now, each of these components of the rhetorical situation are going to change how you do things. So let me give you an example. If you are trying to submit a paper, right, say you have a final for the end of this class and you want an A. That is your purpose. Now, because of that purpose, these 3 things are going to change, right? They're going to be altered. So as a speaker, you're probably going to use more formal language. You're going to use probably a better vocabulary than you would in informal situations. You're obviously not going to curse or anything like that. And that's specifically not just because of your purpose, but also because of your audience, right? Who is it that you're talking to here? Me, right? It would be your professor. And then, of course, your message is going to be specific to what the assignment is asking you, obviously, if you want to meet the purpose of getting an A. Now, we could contrast that, and so now you'll really kind of see how these things change. Let's talk about Facebook. So this is another kind of rhetorical situation. You're still the speaker here, but obviously the audience is different. So it's people you know, friends, family, that sort of thing. So you would use much less formal language, right? You probably could curse on Facebook. And of course, your message is going to be different. You're not obviously doing a paper here, so you're going to change what you're doing. Your purpose is going to depend, right? You may want your audience to see you as someone who's really, say, fun and outgoing. So your messages might be a lot of pictures and events that you've gone to. Or maybe you want your audience to see you as someone who is very intelligent and up to date. So your messages might consist a lot of articles and postings on things that are happening around the world. So what I'm going to do now, just to explain a little bit more about the rhetorical situation, is show you a short video. This is actually from another professor talking about the rhetorical situation.
In the video and Introduction to Rhetoric, we described rhetoric as the study of how meaningful communication occurs and how we might best shape our writing or speech to meet the demands of particular situations. In this video, we'll analyze an example rhetorical situation with the rhetorical triangle in order to better understand what we mean when we talk about rhetoric. Let's say you're facing a situation that many incoming students do. You have to buy textbooks and they cost a lot. In fact, you're about $300 short of what you thought you needed. Now you need to ask for a little help. You begin to think of some people you might be able to ask and what you might say to each: a friend, your parents, and perhaps your boss. In order to think about this rhetorically, we'll need to analyze the situation at hand. That is, we need to break it down by the components we saw in our first video on the rhetorical triangle: the speaker, audience, text or message, and purpose. As we do that, our overarching goal is to think about how we might need to change our message based on how these components change and interact. Let's first look at what you might say to your friend. The relationship is probably quite close and casual, so you might simply walk up to the friend and ask, "Hey, any way you could help me with money for books? You know I'm good for it." With your parents, whom you also have a close relationship with, you could probably also be quite casual and simply ask them, "Hey Mom and Dad, is there any way I could borrow $300? It's for books for school. I promise I won't spend it on anything else and I'll pay you back really soon." Now, things may very well change with your boss, depending on how close you are to them. Chances are you have a more formal relationship with them than with your friends or family, and it's worth keeping in mind that your boss has a position of power over you. So here, your communication might be more formal. You might even think about sending a letter or email to your boss since, in a business setting, those can be more professional than simply approaching them and speaking in person. So perhaps we write, "Dear Mrs. Smith, I'm writing to ask if you might be able to advance me $300 in pay so that I can buy textbooks for school. It's not quite prepared for how expensive they all were going to be, and would very much appreciate your helping me out. Thank you for your consideration. Sincerely, Travis." As you can see, in each case our message changes somewhat to better fit the new situation. In this case, those changes might seem pretty obvious, to the point that thinking about this rhetorically wasn't maybe necessary. But more is happening that first meets the eye here, so let's take a look at the rhetorical dynamics of what's happening. When thinking about this rhetorically, we do know that in each situation our purpose was the same: to persuade our audience to loan us money for books. So to make things a little clearer, let's pull that out. What did change each time was our audience. First our friend, then our family, and lastly our boss. As we saw, when our audience changed, so did the message. Another way of saying that is that the audience influenced how we composed our message, or what our message looked and sounded like. With our friend, it was okay to just go up and talk to them, so we used speech, and we were informal because we know our friend well. The one thing that we did add was the promise of repayment. Because we're borrowing a decent amount of money, the friend probably wants to know they'll get it back. With our parents, we would probably still go up and talk to them because we know them so well, so speech again. But we might also be a little more formal than we were with our friend. And here we added an extra promise of responsibility because we know that our parents would want to think we're responsible people. Where it changes most, of course, is with our boss. We're not used to asking someone who's in a position of power over us for favors, so the way we approach it needs to be a little more delicate. In fact, it's probably a good idea to change the form of the message entirely, from simply going up to the boss and asking something so unusual, to writing a letter, which is more formal and businesslike, something your boss might appreciate. Here too, some more explanation might be called for because the request is an unusual one to make to your boss. And of course, because it's not someone you're close to, Some extra thanks wouldn't hurt. So the audience then determines how or what we speak or write. And at its most basic, that's rhetoric. Changing how we communicate in the situation at hand in order to have the best result, whether that result is to persuade someone, inform them, or accomplish some other purpose. It's important to keep in mind something we mentioned in our introduction to the concept of rhetoric, and that's that every part of the rhetorical situation affects each other part. For example, though it might not seem like it, you as the speaker or writer change throughout this. If you think about it from your audience's point of view, you probably appeared like a different person in each case. That is, to your friend, you were an easygoing, nice, informal buddy. To your parents, you were the good, responsible son or daughter. And for your boss, your letter signaled to her that you were a respectful, hardworking, grateful employee that they'd be most likely to help out. In that sense, the audience helps determine how the writer or speaker will want to appear, and so we can see how another part of the rhetorical triangle is affected by the audience. And we can keep drawing our arrows here. Another way to think about this is that the persona we wanted to express changed the message we gave as well. So, when we wanted to appear like the good child, we told our parents how responsible we would be when we spoke to them. And we can think about it the other way as well. The message we've crafted tells the audience who we are as a person, so in that sense, the text or message defines the speaker or writer. And of course, the speaker or writer, if they do their job well, is going to have an effect on the audience, making them do, think, or believe something. So the speaker or writer affects the audience too. Similarly, because the speaker or writer is only known through their message or text, the text or message has an effect on the audience. And so all of these connect. They all affect each other, and they all work together in order to meet our purpose. Now, if this seems really complex, one thing to note here is that you don't necessarily need to consider all of these angles at once. The example here is to show you how the rhetorical situation could be considered. But as you're going to see in your class, part of using rhetoric well is finding out which of these angles to focus on the most.
So the last theory we're going to talk about is the rhetorical canons, and this actually is coming from the Romans, who developed further on what the Greeks came up with for rhetoric. So the 5 canons of rhetoric, I like to think of it as kind of a recipe for an effective speech or even for writing, and it breaks down into 5 steps: invention, arrangement, style, memory, and delivery. And this is the basic concept on how we're going to create speeches throughout the class. So let's start with invention. Now, its formal definition is sort of looking for persuasive ways to present information or arguments, but there's a lot of things that actually fit under invention. Things like picking your topic, which you're going to actually be looking at a video in a second on this. Doing some research, which we'll be discussing probably in the next class. Picking your persuasive techniques when we move on to persuasion and argumentation. So really kind of the gathering of your material is what invention is. Then we move on to arrangement, right? So now that you've actually gotten the material, how do you in fact organize it? Now, speeches follow a very similar pattern to essays of sort of an introduction, a body, a conclusion. That's actually something that the Romans came up with, so it's a tried and true format. Other things like transitions, signposts, there are definitely going to be a few things that are going to change. There will be specific organizational formats that we'll talk about as well. Then you move on to style. Now you may be wondering why I have a picture of Christmas decorations. I like to think of style as kind of the way you decorate your speech, the way you add to it. So at the beginning of this, when I talked about rhetoric, if you thought of rhetorical question, well, that's a stylistic device, right? It adds interest, or something like a metaphor or imagery. Also, just something like using correct language. So if you're talking about a more serious topic, you're going to use more formal language that's not humorous, and vice versa if it's a humorous topic or a less serious one. So this is making sure that it's not only appropriate, but that it's interesting for the audience. Then we move on to memory. Now, do not worry, you're not going to have to memorize your speeches. This was really a Greek and Roman thing. But what I am going to urge you to do is practice your speech. And I hear this from students all the time, and I don't know why. They say, no, I'm not going to practice my speech. That'll just make me more nervous. That is not the case. In fact, and I have research to back this up, the more you practice, the more prepared you will feel, and of course also using some of the other techniques we talked about last time will be very, very helpful in making sure that you do well, of course, on the last step, which is delivery. So what we'll be talking about here is eye contact, hand gestures, tone inflection, articulation, all those really important things to being an effective verbal speaker. Now, the way I like to think of the 5 canons of rhetoric is kind of like your steps to your speech, right? So we first start with invention, topic, research, kind of gathering the material, putting it together, arrangement, then organizing it, style, adding to it, decorating it. Not memorizing it, but definitely practicing it a lot. And then, of course, how to deliver it, which all leads to your speech. So, we have now talked about 2 major theories, right? We've defined rhetoric, and we've also talked about the rhetorical situation and the rhetorical canons. As far as how it's going to work in the class, for every single speech that we do, we're going to talk about, right? So what is the rhetorical situation of an informative speech? And then, of course, go through the steps. Now, the rhetorical situation in a persuasive speech is going to be different, and of course some of the steps are going to be different as well. And of course the same thing in the argumentative speech. So this is really going to be kind of our guide, like going through each of these steps and talking about these different things. So rhetoric is really, really important and at the core of what we're going to be discussing throughout the semester. Okay, so here's your first set of homework. A couple of questions, they shouldn't take long to answer. Who is the father of rhetoric? What is invention? You don't need a big definition for that. What is the rhetorical situation? How did the rhetorical situation change or alter in the example video? You don't need a lot. You can just give me one specific example. You shouldn't need more than a sentence for this. And what was Plato's concern about rhetoric? Alright, so that is it for the first video. You probably need to watch the second one on your topic. And that is it.